Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2015 Sheikh Abdullah Saleh Kamel International Symposium, An Energy Revolution, Political Ecologies of Shale Oil in the Middle East, United States, and China. I want to thank all of you for making the trip from abroad or from the United States to be with us today, or even from our own campus. I want to thank all my colleagues for contributing to the panel. And I want to especially thank Dr. Peter Glick for giving our symposium an excellent start last night with his very engaging and thought-provoking keynote address. And I'm sure that his observations will continue to resonate throughout the proceedings. I want to also thank my CCS colleagues, Fida Adeli, Rochelle Davis, Imad Shaheen, for chairing their respective panels, and I give special thanks to Joseph Sassoon and Marwa Daoudy of the Symposium Committee for their help in conceptualizing and formatting the conference. And it goes without saying that none of this would have been possible without the tireless efforts and support of the terrific staff of the CCS and the work-study students. Rania Kiblawi, Kelly Harris, Susan Douglas, Viggy Filosic, Julie Yell, and I want to give a special thanks to our tireless public events coordinator, Tariq Radi, who's, I want to thank him for his epic efforts in dealing with the logistics of the conference. But I will point them all out to you, because don't want you to hesitate to ask for their assistance. Trust me, you will be in excellent hands. And I would now like to invite Professor James Reardon Anderson, Acting Dean of the School of Foreign Service, to offer his welcoming remarks. Dean Reardon Anderson is Sun Yat-sen Professor of Chinese Studies in the School of Foreign Service. He's been a member of the Georgetown faculty since 1985 and has served as Director of the Committee on Scholarly Communication with the People's Republic of China. He's also been Director of Asian Studies here at Georgetown, as well as Director of the Master of Science in Foreign Service. Dean Reardon Anderson is author of 5 books on the history and politics of China, most recently Reluctant Pioneers, China's Expansion Northward, 1644-1937. And I want to thank Dean Reardon Anderson for his support of the conference and for taking the time from his very, very busy schedule to be with us today. So thank you very much, Dean.
Thank you, Osama. Well, deans are not that busy, but the board of directors is here this week, which took me away from your dinner last night. I'm sorry to have missed it, but I'm going to snub them today and stay with you because I'm especially interested in this topic and especially grateful both to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, one of our jewels in our crown, the staff of CCAS, and to Sheikh Abdullah Saleh Kamel for his support of this symposium, which is our annual attempt to sort out the affairs of the Middle East. I would say this symposium also represents the direction of the School of Foreign Service in its 2nd century. We're coming up to the end of our 1st century in 2019, and we are doing what we can to reorient the study of international relations from its base in the 20th century, which was essentially the story of relationships between states. If you think of the major events of the 20th century, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, these were primarily conflicts between states. And increasingly in the 21st century, we see that whereas states continue to be the principal actors, the challenges they face are increasingly coming from outside the state system, and specifically from the physical environment, in things like climate change, food, water, disease, and with regard to this conference in particular, innovations in shale oil technology and the shale revolution. So I'm especially pleased that the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and Sheikh Abdullah have chosen this topic this year, which I think is a very important issue for us to think about, and also to help, as we help direct our students to the agenda of international affairs in the 21st century. So I look forward to benefiting from the contributions of our several scholars and to taking away as much as I can from this conference. So thank you for all for coming. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Marwa Daoudy. I'm an assistant professor at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in the School of Foreign Service. I have the privilege today to introduce the first panel on environmental, social, and economic challenges relating to new energy sources and shale oil in particular. We will have each presenter talk for 20 minutes. As we get closer to the expiration of your allocated time, I will signal to you, discreetly, hopefully, as you're speaking. And then after the presentations, we will have a chance to ask questions to our panelists. And I wanted to say also that Professor Beach has had problems with his plane coming through Boston. In fact, he's delayed, so he will be speaking later. And Mrs. Babar has graciously agreed to swap places and to speak this morning instead of later with the third panel instead of the first panel. Let me introduce each speaker, and then we'll have them go to the podium and present their talk. First, we'll have Dr. Jeremy Boak, who's project manager at the Colorado School of Mines. Dr. Boak is the director of the Center for Oil, Shale Technology and Research at the school, co-chair of the Oil Shale Symposium from 2006 to 2014, and a member of the board of San Leon Energy. Before joining the Colorado School, he was a project manager in environmental and nuclear materials management at Los Alamos National Laboratory and project manager for the US Department of Energy. And Dr. Boak will be speaking about hydrocarbon resources for low permeability rock concepts, global resources, and geological constraints. It sounds very technical and interesting. Please go to the podium.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been some time since I've been to DC, and I haven't been to the Georgetown campus. I'm now going to have to make a serious recommendation to my nephew who's going through the college application process that he give this serious consideration here. It's a beautiful location and an exciting place to be. Just seeing the names on the buildings is appealing and interesting, and you certainly have a lovely campus. And it's a pleasure to speak at the Sheikh Abdullah Saleh Kamel Symposium. On 3 occasions, I've actually had the opportunity to visit Jordan. I haven't been to other Middle Eastern countries, but have been intrigued, fascinated, and it brings one a kind of immediate appreciation for the challenges that the Middle Eastern world faces. I'm going to talk a little bit about unconventional reservoir characteristics, about these shaly resources, these fine-grained rocks that are very impermeable and hence require a great deal of stimulation in order to produce hydrocarbons from them. A little bit about the size of the unconventional resources in the Middle East, in China, and in North America. About some, and finally about some potential stumbling blocks to their use. So increasingly in the past several decades, the hydrocarbon industry has moved to more and more challenging reservoirs to produce natural gas and oil from. First, moving into tight, relatively impermeable sands that needed to be fractured in order to produce. We did a lot of experimentation, some of it, in fact, enhanced by the government. In addition, there was a great deal of work done on coal bed methane, on getting natural gas out of deeply buried coal that had enough natural gas as a consequence of breakdown of the coal itself to be a productive reservoir. And then finally into organic rich mudstones that are generally the source rocks for most petroleum, but are now being treated as reservoirs because we can in fact drill through extended parts of them and complete them in such a way that we can actually get the oil and natural gas out of them. The first were generally those that had natural gas in them because it's a lighter molecule. It flows more readily through these fractured rocks. And these are called gas shales, and they account for greater than 40% of gas production in the United States. And then finally, people began to realize, well, if we can do that for the ones that have gas in them, maybe we can get oil out of some of these other rocks. Although, in fact, so that there was a natural translation to talking about oil shale and shale oil. But actually, most of these reservoirs are in layers that are interbedded with the shale source rock itself. And the real connection is that in many cases, the hydrocarbons haven't gone a long way from where they were formed. I've sometimes referred to all of these as home buddy hydrocarbons, because they didn't really migrate as far. In contrast, the oil sands of Alberta and of Utah and Venezuela are hydrocarbons that have migrated a long way and along the path have lost a lot of the light fraction so that they become relatively heavy, and that's why they're called tar sands in some cases. But the oil resources have been called shale oil, they've been called tight oil, they've been called light tight oil. It looks to me like the industry is settling down on the term tight oil, although I've never seen any oil that I thought of as particularly tight. It's kind of a loose sort of stuff. One of the problems here is that there are two terms that are required for these resources, one for the rock and one for the product itself. And I use this example from the state of Utah to explain to students and to others the relationship of the two. If you take these organic rich rocks represented in purple up here, and you take them deep enough to make rock out of them rather than just loose sediment, you will change some of the organic matter, but you'll still have a largely solid, very complex organic matter that isn't much altered from the plants and algae and other organisms that it was formed from. For more than 100 years, these have been referred to as oil shale. So technical precedence goes to these rocks that do not actually have liquid or gaseous hydrocarbons in them, but are the feedstock for the natural system that makes hydrocarbons. If you bury these down to what we refer to geologically as the top of the oil window, and it's marked, you can detect it in various alterations in the organic matter as well as in the rock itself, you get into what I once referred to as oil-bearing shale, but is also, and the product is shale-hosted oil. Now industry seems to be settling on this term tight oil for them, partly because many of them would not be classically called shale. In fact, one of the first things most people hear about this rock that I spend a lot of time worrying about is that it's a misnomer because there's no oil in it. There's just solid hydrocarbons that you can cook into making oil. If it were really true that that's a misnomer, it would also be a misnomer to refer to Cabernet Sauvignon as a wine grape. It requires sophisticated technical means to get the wine out of the grape, and it takes technically sophisticated methods to get the oil out of the shale. And that's true whether it's this stuff where it's all solid, or this stuff where you actually have liquid and gaseous hydrocarbons in the rock, but the rocks are so impermeable that they won't naturally move towards a wellbore. If you bury it still deeper, down into this part of it, you get gas shale and shale gas. So that sort of sets the terms for today, and I hate to say it, but I've sort of already corrupted the title of the conference thereby. Shale is the most common rock type in the world. There are places that don't have much shale. Greenland, where some of the oldest rocks on the planet occur, the ones that I worked on for my dissertation, has almost no sedimentary rock left on it, and most of it has been fairly extensively cooked. On the other hand, countries like Russia have a great deal of opportunities in shale. And I'll come back to something about this later, because what it really comes down to is large countries have large shale deposits. Shale is a rock that has extremely small pores, relatively low porosity, and hence fluid flow through little tiny holes like this and trying to connect across even smaller passages like this is exceedingly difficult. And that's what presents the challenge. Most of our traditional oil reservoirs have relatively good flow from pore to pore and ultimately towards a borehole that you drill into it and create a pressure gradient in. So one of the things we use for comparison is sidewalk cement and granite. And two of the major shale plays in the world, the Montney in Canada and the Barnett, are down in the granite range and distinctly tighter than sidewalk cement. Even the Bakken, the reservoir that produces oil in North Dakota, is actually quite low on the scale. in these very, very tight rocks. And here are the general oil field rocks. I've highlighted here where conventional production is feasible. Tight gas, of course, flows more readily than oil, so you can go down to lower levels. And here, you can get away with some fracturing. The best reservoirs are out here where you don't even need to fracture the rock. But the really tough ones are these where you have to do massive hydraulic fracturing, where you, first of all, drill horizontally into the well to expose more surface, and then you do multiple stages of hydraulic fracturing, of injection of water and sand to hold the pores open, and a tiny fraction, less than about a 0.5% of chemicals that help stabilize and keep the fluids from becoming infected with bacteria. Shale covers a multitude of sins these days. Every rock plotted on here has been called a shale, although traditionally shale as a term is reserved for these rocks with very high fractions of clay minerals, very gooey, flaky minerals that tend to make for a soft rock, but they also tend to be really good for capturing organic matter that we need to have in order to make oil and gas. Plenty of other rocks lie far away from this, and in fact, nearly every reservoir producing shale gas or oil, it lies somewhere over in here at much lower clay contents because these rocks break better. There's a tendency for, as you go down this way, for the brittleness to decrease and for the clay and organic content to increase, so that the best source rocks are the hardest to frack. It also helps to get a little age because you can change from one clay to another, and they frack. Certain clays are better than others at holding a rock together. So to look at the resources in the world, first of all, this is a new game. IHS, the data people, track shale gas back to the early 1990s, but there were relatively few players, and the production was nothing that was going to capture anybody's attention. And in fact, the very first hydrocarbon production in the US produced gas from one of the shales that's now producing in the tight gas area, and produced gas that lit the streets in Fredonia, New York in the 1830s before Colonel Drake drilled his oil well down in Pennsylvania. But ARI, Advanced Resources International, has put together a report for the Energy Information Administration evaluating a wide range of basins around the world. But you'll notice some critical gaps. The Middle East and on up into the Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, et cetera, and even over in Afghanistan, all of these countries were not evaluated for a variety of reasons. And sampling was much denser, of course, in the US, where all of this is actually active and the uncertainties are less. So that's one basis for looking, and they've ranked some 30 or 35 different countries in terms of the available shale gas resource and shale-hosted oil resources. And you'll notice that Russia, the United States, China, big countries, tend to rank high on this. So I did quickly look at what happens if you divide that resource by the area of the nation for these 10 countries. Might change substantially if you looked at some of the smaller countries on the list. But that produces this list, and you can see that the United States, China, and Russia move substantially downward. So the shale resources are aerially very widely distributed, and that's an important aspect of this feature and of these resources that has to be taken into consideration. It's still a matter of they're generally nationally contained, so that, I mean, some of these cross boundaries, but the important point is they're owned by a nation, and the rules of that nation govern the ability to develop them. That's why the US is leading. Schlumberger has also done an evaluation of these oil and gas plays. They aggregated it in large regions, so you don't have as much breakdown by country, but at least they give it a value for the Middle East, relatively modest. This is in billions of barrels of oil equivalent. The article that I cite here does not give you the underlying details, so you can't go back and look at how much oil, how much gas. But it does make it clear that Asia is a hot spot, that the US, of course, is a major opportunity, and Russia has begun to develop this resource, but they're a little bit behind the curve. South America is also a major player. in these resources, gas predominates. This was an interesting discovery for me, that in fact, you'll notice that about 85% of the resource is largely in the gas shales, and only about 10 to 15% in the oil liquids resources. And they do not provide, this was most intriguing, this key over here, but they don't explain it in the article, and you don't get the underlying data or report unless, I guess, you're a subscriber. So those of us in universities have to figure out some other way to get a hold of that data. The other feature that particularly the oil portion of this is fairly abundant, but relatively expensive to produce. And that's because every well costs about anywhere from $5 to $20 million, depending on where you drill it. Drilling in Europe is much more expensive than it is in North America, and you don't have the added incentive of having private ownership of mineral rights that makes landowners eager to have a rig on their property. And few countries in the world have anything like that. That's why these resources are being developed in the US and Canada much more readily than in other countries. And Canada has encouraged it from the government side, because they also don't have this private ownership. There are lots of interesting information to look at about how Schlumberger decided what resources would be developed, but I want to emphasize primarily here that they anticipate North America being the dominant provider of these light, tight oils and of all of, at least the oil side of the equation for the immediate future, and only later do you see the rest of the world beginning to ramp up, with South America being distinguished here separately. Their expectation is that new conventional production will actually maintain the conventional resources as a dominant provider of oil and gas in the world. That's a remarkable conclusion. This requires discovery of very large amounts of oil and gas in conventional reservoirs in the next few decades, but that these unconventionals will be the source of major new supply that meet the growing demand. And of that, the light, tight oil and natural gas liquids captured from the shale gas will be the dominant resources that meet that demand. To move on to the Middle East, and I thought I'd include North Africa. This was the only real estimate I had. It's interesting that the African reserves, which include substantial input from South Africa, actually are larger than those expected from the Middle Eastern countries that they analyzed. In North America, you have 1,000 trillion cubic feet of gas potentially recoverable and about 21 billion barrels of oil. It's a fairly substantial amount. In China, about the same amount of gas and a larger amount of oil potentially recoverable. So these are very large resources. It looks like North America and China will provide a little bit more of that, although a conversation with a young colleague who has just come back from 3 years in China, suggests that he thinks these numbers should be reduced, he said, by a factor of 10. He might be a little bit over-energized, but I think there are significant challenges in developing the Chinese resources, and that has to do with geology, has to do with know-how. At the very least, it will take many years for China to ramp up these kind of efforts. And on to a couple of challenges. There's a large part of the world that is short on water. Peter highlighted this really effectively yesterday. There's a great deal of water in the area in between. It's seawater. And Middle Eastern countries have been fairly effective at finding ways to use seawater in oil field operations, particularly for enhanced recovery. So there's some opportunity there to work on that question. But it's still going to be a significant economic challenge. If we can use seawater, there's no shortage. But the real issue is about access to the relatively cleaner, purer source water that we all also want to use for agriculture, for drinking, for power generation. And the quality and the ability to reuse water is a significant challenge for the future. But I do want to highlight that here is conventional oil and gas production, how much water is used per mile. This is for transportation. If you think that biofuels are going to be our savior, you need to look at this issue here. Because if you have to irrigate, it's not a water saver. It's a massive, massive water user. The amount of water used in hydraulic fracturing is going to be tiny by comparison. I'll show you this slide about Colorado water use. Out of the 4 trillion gallons of water used per year, if we developed a 400,000 barrel of oil per day oil shale resource, the stuff I work on, which is actually more water intensive than hydraulically fractured wells, you're still only using 0.4% of the world's of the water that Colorado uses. Agriculture is the dominant usage, and we have to ask the question not, is there enough water? It's, can we shift some of these usages? How much do we have discretion to shift from one application to another? We shouldn't be squeezing out new opportunities because of tradition. We have to ask how much corn should we be growing in Colorado? We might even have to ask how many grapes we should be growing in western Colorado to make wine out of, because they all require irrigation. A second issue, methane emissions, leakage from our natural gas system, from our oil and gas systems, because they all have some methane in them. A recent report. I'm now working on a project trying to figure out which is more accurate, the inventory of emissions or the measurements of emissions made by airborne and ground-based systems. There's a significant difference. Generally, the measurements made on the ground and in the air lead to higher estimates of the amount of methane leaking from oil and gas operations. There are complications because there are also methane emissions from what are called confined animal feeding operations, or CAFOs in bureaucratic speak, and other landfills, a variety of other methane sources. So that's a significant issue because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, 28 times as effective as CO2. But a report just out today, actually released yesterday, I think, in Environmental Science and Technology, pointed out that of the facilities they had measured in a carefully designed study, 2 of the 45, I think it was 45 or 46 studied, were showing emissions that were greater than the other 43. So it's very concentrated. Last issue, cost. It's been very much in the news lately. What's the break-even cost for all of these oil and gas plays? And I'll leave it there. You still have to make a profit on these things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Boak, for clarifying, setting the stage, the geological challenges, very useful to us, and also clarifying the semantics of the whole discussion, and at the same time challenging our title. So this panel is about environmental, social, economic challenges, and we will be moving on now to a discussion on other challenges relating to food, and I'm pleased to introduce Mrs. Babar, who will be speaking about food security challenges in the Middle East. Mrs. Babar is Associate Director for Research at the Center for International and Regional Studies at Georgetown University in Qatar. Previously, she has served with the International Labour Organization and the United Nations Development Programme, and her current research interests include rural development, Gulf migration and labour policy, citizenship in the Persian Gulf states, food security, of course, and GCC regional integration. Thank you.
Thank you, Marwa. Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. And I've been put in the middle between 2 extremely scientific and technological people. And it's somewhat intimidating since I don't even know how to put my SIM card into my iPhone, and I'm not kidding. When the CCAS director and a good friend asked me to participate in this conference, for a second or more, I was very confused as to how my areas of work on food security in the Middle East could possibly tie in with a conference that was going to be looking at energy issues. But I'm really grateful that I was invited to do this because it actually forced me to think about things that I've been working on for 4 years in quite a different way. For the past 4 years, based in Qatar, I've been involved in a project which has looked at the ways in which food security challenges have been addressed, how they exist across a very diverse region, and also the kinds of programs and policies that different Middle Eastern countries have implemented to try and deal with food security. And although in many conversations and our own work that we've done on this is always a reference to the food, energy, and water nexus, and the fact that these are complex systems which all need to function efficiently and together, the role of energy has actually not been something that has been prioritized in this way. And so what I've done today, and what I want to talk to you about, is a little bit about what's happening in the Middle East in terms of food security, how it's conceived and how it's being dealt with. And then more broadly, what the role of energy really is, not just within the Middle East, but how energy and energy resources really are incorporated into food production and the food supply chain. To begin with, I'll reference a little of the work on the Middle East that I have done. Despite looking at the region right now with all its multiple challenges, the fact is that actually over the course of the past 3 decades, the Middle East has done fairly well in terms of combating poverty and rates quite highly on its development indicators. By global indices and measurements of food security, the Middle East actually doesn't rank very high. The GHI, which is the Global Hunger Index, actually ranks Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Latin America as having a far greater vulnerability and exposure to food security than the Middle East. But studying the region, studying the Middle East through the lens of food security once again brings to the forefront that this is a region with very complicated and complex geography. And particularly when you're trying to generalize statistics across countries as diverse as, say, Qatar and Yemen, 2 states both on the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen, unfortunately, suffers from about 35% of the population in Yemen is considered undernourished, and that's a threat, while Qatar, of course, is one of the highest GDPs per capita globally and is an immensely wealthy nation. So again, trying to apply statistics across this region and assume that the Middle East is not food insecure, it doesn't really capture the realities and the particular sort of ways in which vulnerabilities may be hidden by statistics. The other thing, of course, is that, again, the statistics don't normally, not just at a sub-regional level, but they don't speak to sub-national variations amongst, say, the rural-urban divide and other sort of demographically organized subdivisions within countries. But regardless, whether or not the rest of the world perceives the Middle East as being particularly food insecure or not, Middle Eastern states certainly have prioritized this as an area of active intervention, policy making, and have devoted a lot of resources to it. The Gulf Cooperation Council, the 6 GCC states, which of course are energy rich, but incredibly food poor for obvious climatic reasons, aridity and lack of water, they have not been able to, they are not able to meet their food needs domestically. And given the healthy balance of payments these countries have had over the last few years, decades rather, it's not as though they're not able to pay for their externally sourced supplies of food. But there is this increasing sense that this dependency, the lack of self-sufficiency in food, has to be addressed. Energy, a link that I have seen that one can talk about, Saudi Arabia in the 1970s began a massive program converting its energy wealth into greening its deserts, and developed a rather large-scale agricultural program, which meant by the 1980s they were the 6th largest producer of wheat globally, which was extremely strange. And of course have now pulled back from that, from the 1990s onwards, because they realized that the self-sufficiency was no good if it came at the cost of completely depleting their underground water aquifers. And so that program has been rolled back. Similar programs, though, have sort of approaches have been adopted since 2007, 2008, when we saw that the global spike in food prices. Several of the other GCC states started taking an active interest in developing some kind of self-sufficiency of food security, really about sovereignty of food sources rather than the way food security has traditionally been understood. And so some of what I've been interested in is examining what's been happening in Qatar. They established 6 years ago a national, it's very strategic, large-scale program, the Qatar National Food Security Program, which was dedicated towards finding ways for Qatar to get away from its current predicament of depending on 90% of its food is imported. And so they developed this whole kind of strategic approach. But again, one of the issues for Qatar, believe it or not, considering its resources, is that it was an energy issue in the end as well, because the country depends entirely on desalinated water, which is very energy intensive. And to increase the desalination options for irrigation purposes was not considered to be a sound choice. Broadly, getting out of the Middle East now and looking at just food security and energy in a more global perspective, strangely enough, at least from what I can see, or what I was able to find, the role of hydrocarbons and fossil fuels and its interaction with food issues and food security, at least from the social science perspective, has really been understudied. We know instinctively that fossil fuels and hydrocarbons play a critical role in global food systems, but oddly enough, there's just not much that's been written on this or looked at it. What the global food security narrative suggests is that this is a challenge which is going to increase in the coming decades. And the story that seems to emerge is that we had a fantastic century last century because we were able to make enormous strides in meeting our expanding food needs through huge increases in agricultural production, technological interventions in the agriculture sector, etc. And a lot of this was dependent on the fact that we had access to easily available and cheap energy. But the story moving forward seems to suggest that now, with a diminishing amount of cultivatable land globally, very depleting water resources, and a predicament in terms of what we do about hydrocarbons, that moving forwards to our 2050 target of being able to feed 9 billion people, it seems to be a big ask. And so in the studies that I've read, which examine retrospectively what we were able to do around food production in the last century, as well as those that are a little more pessimistic or in terms of discussing the future food challenges ahead of us, both these sorts of sets of studies, again, I don't feel adequately incorporate the role that energy has played in a healthy, functioning food system. So I think a point worth making is that while energy in the shape of hydrocarbons and fossil fuels are critical to food security and the functioning of our global food system, there are variations, geographic variations across the world in terms of how energy is used by all along the way, from agricultural food production as well as all along the food supply chain. And so basically energy is consumed in the world, across the world, in different ways. In the developed world, there's a heavy dependency on hydrocarbons for industrial agriculture. I mean, that was the great leap forward in the Green Revolution. We ended up with these large industrial agricultural production sites, and so where fuel is necessary for mechanized farming, irrigation systems, fertilizer application, and not just in the actual on-farm activities, but in the developed world also, the other parts of the food system, preparation, preservation, processing, storage, transportation, all of these rely heavily on hydrocarbon and energy sources. And by contrast, the situation in the developing world is quite different. Again, we have different issues there, small farm holdings, etc. And the energy resource that is consumed most in those countries is actually in the form of nitrogen fertilizers, which I think is quite interesting. So basically, the developed world makes a lot more food, produces a lot more food, but it also consumes a lot more energy in doing so and produces a larger carbon footprint. whereas, you know, in the developing world, this just isn't the case. So this small body of work, which examines the interconnections and integration between issues of energy and food systems, has suggested that the primary reason for our last century's success in producing larger amounts of food to feed the world's population was as a result of inexpensive, easily available hydrocarbon energy sources. And these studies, which look forward with a degree of alarmism, excuse me, suggest that if we are to proceed to be able to feed another 2 billion people over the course of the next 35 years, how do we do so in a situation where the energy landscape is changing and changing for the worse? So a lot of the predictions made along that line arise out of the peak oil framework, or what you're thinking, I suppose, assuming that oil and gas is going to become much more expensive and less easily available, and so, you know, how this is going to have a dire impact on food production globally. One of the questions before us now, and I have no answers to this is what I think what needs to be studied though, is so if we're looking at a different energy landscape now, if we're in a situation where actually, excuse my incorrect terminology, but shale oil, gas, fracking, all those things, if now we've got a new environment around us, and there's going to be lots of gas and lots of oil and lots of cheap hydrocarbon energy available, are we going to be able to do another great leap forward? Is shale going to be the great leap forward to future food security? Does it improve our potential for addressing food security and insecurity? Does it impede it? I don't know. There's no work out on this yet, but it's interesting. 5 minutes. What we do know is that the existing resources now, suddenly the predictions for the natural gas available to us globally have gone up sharply. And obviously there's a lot of controversy, and we know that there are a lot of issues regarding environmental and all sorts of things. I can't address those. I am not a scientist. But what I do think is interesting and is out there is that this is going to really help in terms of producing nitrogen fertilizer. And yes, I'm going to spend 1 minute talking about fertilizer because I think this is really interesting. When we think of how the Middle Eastern countries are integrated into the global food, whatever we want to call it, system, the assumption is they're the consumers, right? I mean, the Middle East does not produce food globally in abundance, and is like 50% of the food needs of the Middle East are imported in. And I think the 6 of the world's top wheat importing producers are all Arab states. So the Middle East is consistently viewed as, yes, a producer of energy, but the consumer of food. And yet, after the Black Sea resources, after Russia, the second largest source for nitrogen-based fertilizers is the Persian Gulf. I mean, it's Iran and Qatar. And I think this is interesting because I think we need to expand the way we think about some of these issues and look at these critical interconnections so that it pushes a bit against these frameworks of, you know, which sort of securitize the whole issue of food security. The story, for example, in Qatar or the GCC states has been, as long as you have oil and gas, you can sell that, you can buy food. But actually, it's more than that, isn't it? Because we need this nitrogen fertilizer to grow food in a lot of the world. So actually, they're intrinsically and sort of connected in agricultural output through their production of fertilizers. I have like 2 minutes or something now, which is scary. But so again, there's a lot of discussion out there on how do we deal with our food issues in a sustainable manner. And there has been this impetus to, well, a lot of discussion to move towards more sustainable, green economy. And although there are multiple factors that are pushing the debate in terms of how we reframe, change, and reorder our agricultural systems, and the impetus comes from environmentalists, climate change, multiple of political and social reasons, but also in part they're driven by the fears of diminishing oil and gas. So another question is the momentum towards more sustainable agricultural production and a change in the way we produce food, where there's so many polemical debates out there. But the fact is the shale discovery of the changing energy landscape going to mean then that we see less momentum for thinking differently about how we produce food? I'm not a scientist or an agriculturalist, and I can't say with any degree of certainty one way or the other where we need to go in terms of securing how food is produced for our future generations. But I think what I can say is that there is a need to explore alternatives, because if the current system was functioning optimally, we wouldn't be dealing with the fact that a lot of people still are not accessing food. As many others who've worked on food security suggest, food security itself is not just reliant on increasing agricultural output, but managing a complex range of issues and outcomes, which include the environment, human ecology, and political economy. In conclusion, I'd just take less than a moment, I promise. But, oh, I have 2 minutes? Great, because I cut a bunch off. What I would like us to think about for a moment is how similar some of the nation-centric debates are around energy security and food security. Viewed through the lens of security, these two systems which are critical for our human lives center concern around self-sufficiency, the need to be self-reliant in your energy if you want to achieve energy security, to be self-reliant if you want to achieve food security. And this debate, which it's the policy language I see in the GCC around food, and is similar to what I see in other parts of the world that are energy insecure, they engender fears of a vulnerability and the risk exposures, and discuss the need to control the supply chain. And based on this discussion, the securitization of these two different systems, strategic national policy making efforts are developed to what is perceived as being, what is perceived and presenting as being a sort of grave threat to a nation and to its people. And creating this inflated sense of fear, I think, then propels a momentum for developing a means of becoming self-sufficient in that system, and sometimes with clear disregards to consequences and without really addressing the question of at what cost. In 2014, so last summer, end of last summer, Qatar, after an extensive amount of resources and were put in place, actually abandoned its own plans for greening its desert and growing domestic production. Increasing domestic production to 60% was what its initial target had been. The Qatar National Food Security Program no longer exists. It was dismantled. And we could only guess at all the reasons why, but I certainly do believe that part of this was based on the realization that although they had the financial wherewithal and perhaps could have developed lots of interesting technologies, the environmental, financial, and frankly human costs of Qatar trying to turn itself into a self-sufficient food-producing country, they were too high. The costs were too high. And as a result, the reality that Qatar seems to have accepted is that for the foreseeable future, it will be dependent on obtaining its food from overseas. And I think it's something worth thinking about. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahra, for outlining the food, energy, water nexus and the multiple linkages as well with, issues of agriculture, environment, and also the implications and costs of self-sufficiency. This is a brilliant transition to our next speaker, who will be speaking about water more specifically. Would you like to? Yes. Our next speaker is Professor Ziad Mimi, and he's an associate professor of water resources at the Department of Civil Engineering at Birzeit University. Professor Mimi is a technical advisor to governmental agencies, research institutions, and a technical consultant to local and international firms in Palestine and abroad in the area of water resources and hydrology. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm happy here to be at Georgetown University. Actually, when I was good morning again. Actually, when I have received the invitation, I was at the beginning shocked because I see the shale oil, and I'm water engineer, And then I started to think, what is the relation between the two things? Maybe because they are both of them are liquid or not. So I started, I was forced to study a lot before I accepted the invitation, and then I find a lot of connection between them. And yesterday, Peter made this connection between the shale oil and the water. So the first part of my presentation will be about shale oil, but I will not go too technicals because my colleagues here has covered this actually, and I have maybe 3 to 4 slides which is similar. And then I will be touching more the water resources in the MENA region and especially in Palestine. So our Earth in 2050, we will have about 10 billion people living together in the world. And we will have about 1.4 million in the EU MENA region. In our neighborhood, we have conflicts on land and water. We need 5 essentials in 2050. Sufficient food, sufficient energy, sufficient water. We need also a stable economy. We need also a stable climate and limit to further population growth because we have a high population growth there in that area, and we want to achieve peace if we can, which is that since 100 years now we are searching for peace. We need also peace. For this, we need also energy for civilization. We need also clean energy, not only energy. So when we are searching for energy, we should evaluate the resources on the basis of 3 things: the supply, the environmental impact, and how much net useful energy that this provides. Actually, as all of you maybe know, that 80% of the oil, the traditional oil, will be depleted between the next 80 years. So 80% of this crude oil will be maybe finished in the next 100 years. So we should look for more oil. We should not waste oil. We should search for other options. So if you go to the traditional oil, or we call it conventional oil, we have many advantages and many disadvantages. Let's go to the disadvantages. We need to find now other things that to substitute the loss. We need large government subsidies. Environmental costs are not included in the market price. Artificially low price encourages waste and discourages search for alternatives. Pollutes air when produced and burned, releases CO2 when burned, and can cause water pollution. These are the disadvantages of conventional oil. But we have also some advantages like low cost, high net energy yield, easily transported, low land use, technology is well developed, and efficient distribution system. Based on this, the world is going now to the shale oil. I will not discuss this because my colleagues discussed this, how they change the kerosene to shale oil, and this is where it's found. Also, my colleague had discussed this. This also was discussed by my colleagues here in the morning. And let's go now how the extraction methods of the shale oil. We have two methods. One is called surface, open pit, and the second is underground. I will not discuss this in details also because it's too technical, but I will go to disadvantages and advantages because we are taking in this session the environmental and the social and political impacts of shale oil. The disadvantages: high cost, low net energy yield, environmental costs are not included in the market price, large amount of water needed for processing. This is the connections between my original experience, my as a water engineer, and the shale oil. So when I see this, this is one of the major disadvantages of shale oil, especially in the MENA region. It consumes a lot of water, and it's also cause water pollution, and it also increase the air pollution through the CO2 emission. And during the manufacturing of this shale oil, it disturbs the community, it affects the noises of the people there, and therefore there is a lot of social and negative impacts of this shale oil. And as I said to you, now let's go to the MENA region. The MENA region here, we have a physical water scarcity. We have a rapid natural resources degradation and desertification in this MENA region. We have also a groundwater depletion. If you see this figure, there is a lot of groundwater degradation. There is drought, and there is salinity, and climate change will make it worse. Also, we are now experiencing a lot of signs of climate change. Now let's go to our country, to Palestine, where there is a shale oil or not. Actually, in 1990, there was an agreement between the Palestinian Authority and the British Gas to search for gas oil or shale oil in Gaza. And at that time, Ehud Barak, who was the Prime Minister of Israel, approved this, and the British Gas came to Gaza and opened and drilled 2 wells, where they find there that about 1.4 trillion cubic feet of gas. Unfortunately, after this discovery, it was not approved by Israel to continue with this exploring or using this oil. Since 15 years, we're not allowed to use this oil or shale oil gas in Gaza, while the Israelis are using this just a few kilometers behind the borders of Gaza. So we have started this, and we have opened 2 wells in Gaza, but unfortunately, we are not also allowed to use this. Recently, our Prime Minister, Dr. Ramil Hamdallah, who was just since a year now, have prepared the TOR for the companies from the USA and from Britain, England, to search for gas also in the West Bank, in a city or a village near Ramallah, and they prepared the TOR, but unfortunately this was also refused by Israelis to search for this gas or this oil in the West Bank, because as you know, Israel is controlling everything under the ground and above the ground. So also in the term of oil, we're not allowed to even use our resources. So for the water, as you know, if we allow to use the shale oil, if it is in a good amount in the West Bank, we will face another problem in the water, because we have to find this oil and we use it through the water. For the water, it's a big subject in our country. We cannot even if we have the oil, we will not be able to use this water because of many reasons. One, there is a drastic drop in rainfall. If you see this canal is in February, in the middle of the rain season, you find it empty. You see here, these 2 photos, because of the aridity in the West Bank, you can see this photo before years, and this is now. If you can compare the difference. In Gaza, there are more about 4,000 wells there, where most of them are overpumped. If you go to the water equality, you can see how much the WHO drinking water standard for chloride is 250 milligram. You can see here how much samples are above more than 250 milligram for the well chlorides, and even for the well nitrates. So we have polluted groundwater in Gaza. We have thousands of Israeli practices on the water resources. If you see here, we are controlling only 11% of the water resources, while they are controlling 89% of the water resources. If you see the Israeli National Water Carrier, this carrier, which was, they changed the line of the Jordan River to the Negev Desert here, where there is no water now in the Jordan River. Nearly there is no water, and the Dead Sea also is shrinking due to this change. If you see this map, most of the wells this is the West Bank, and this is all the Israeli wells. They have drilled all the wells on the borders of the West Bank in order to prevent or not allowing us to use our water. So you see, this is the red lines here. All of them are Israeli wells. And we are not allowed as Palestinians even to dig a single well, since now 10 years. Also, we have, if you see we are in Palestine, we are not allowed even to install a single pipe between 2 villages. if you want to install a single pipe, you need to have the authority of the approval of Israel, and we are not having this approval even if it's a simple pipes between two villages. So we are also suffering from this. In Palestine, the West Bank, I mean, we have 255 wells, while the Israelis have 51 wells. But our 251, we can collect water or consume water less than their 50s, because we are not allowed to dig deep wells. We are only allowed to dig, if we have the approval, to shallow wells. If you see this, this is one of the, also on the sanitation and the sector of Gaza. This was a wastewater pool, and in the war in 2007 in Gaza, the Israelis also pumped these wastewater pools. And if you see this, this is a pool of wastewater, and you see this after they destroy it by bombs from the planes. So destroy even the wastewater pools. Now the separation wall. Many people think that the separation wall is just a wall to separate or between Palestinians and the Israelis in order to have security. If you follow up the line of the separation wall, you find it is a water line wall. This is the line of the wall. And if you go to the hydrologist, as I am a hydrologist, if you go to this line, you will find it in the edge of the aquifers, down. So we are not allowed to, if we have, this is the West Bank borders. But now the wall is like this, you see? It's different than the West Bank borders. It is a water wall, it's not a separation wall only. In order to not allow us, the Palestinians, to dig wells in front of our land. So this land, for instance, it is in the West Bank, but now the separation wall is here, so they can dig walls here in order not to allow the flow of the water to come to the West Bank. So this is one of the important points for the separation wall. Now what we can do as Palestinians. Now we are living in a very bad situation regarding water resources, regarding oil, regarding energy. We must adapt. Unless, for instance, well, the first thing in adaptation is to start doing what we can do to end the occupation. If we can do this to end the occupation, we can do our homework to invest in our resources, in our energy, in our water, to make sustainable development. The second one is to adapt. If you go to this just photo, you see here a kind of adaptation. The sheep are trying to have water from this small tank. So this is another kind of adaptation. So the first one is to end the occupation, and then we can deal with these resources. So this is a nice photo where it can show that even sheep can adapt with the scarce of water. The last one, the last shot also, you can also adapt by living behind the tanks. So the last thing for me as a scientist here, in order to avoid all of this, we must, as Palestinians, regarding energy, we must go now for renewable energy like suns, like using the cells, or renewable energy like using these solar panels. And it is a good option for Palestinians since we have a lot of sun there. But our problem is with the cost of these cells, because most of these cells are using batteries, and these batteries are usually expensive. So we are now depending on the technology that these cells will be, the cost of these cells will be reduced, and then it will be affordable option, and not using shale oil or oil shale or conventional oil. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you.
Thank you, Ziad, for showing the need to also understand the political context and also ways forward in terms of adaptation and local practices. So now the floor is open for questions. There are 2 microphones on each side of the room. Please come forward, ask your questions to the panelists. Present yourselves briefly first, and if you have a specific question to one of the panelists, please say to whom it's addressed. Are there any? Yes. Any questions?
Hi, I'd be happy to break the ice. My name is George Shambaugh. I'm a faculty member here at the School of Foreign Service. A question both to the first presenter, but perhaps to others too, and that involves China. China is a very curious country on this issue area, in particular because of the extensive pollution and the desire to get them off of coal onto something else. They're also curious in terms of population growth and need to feed their people. They're also curious because they don't have potable water. So it's an extraordinary, but they've got wealth. So it's an extraordinary mix of factors in that country. And I wonder if you could talk about the shale deposits there, because it seems to me that there's a real potential to mitigate some of these problems, but exactly how all of those fit together are unclear.
Thank you, George. Would like to answer?
It's great to start with a really complicated question like that. And I'll start my response by relaying an incident that happened at the symposium that I hold on oil shale, the traditional type of oil shale every year. I had a student on campus who was a Uyghur from Western China. And I had visitors from Turkey who were having trouble understanding what was going on, but Camilla spoke pretty good English, so she ended up translating for them, and I began to realize that there was a large chunk of China that had a very strong tie to the Turkish world. So I think there's an interesting challenge there. That was also a gap on the map there, all that the various countries that end in stan. I see China as having very substantial challenges ahead, and they're actually linked to those of the Middle Eastern and broader Islamic world. Will they be easy to address? China is moving aggressively to try and learn how to produce these kind of resources, but I think it's a long way out, and so they will be challenged. I tend to think of the water issue as very much a local one. It is not, cutting off hydraulic fracturing is not going to solve our water needs issues. But asking hard questions about how do we allocate water, which is a kind of a broader, what humanists tend to call holistic thinking issue, what we techno-weenies call systems engineering, trying to put together all of these issues into one framework and really understand them is going to be a significant challenge. As I say, I had a young colleague who spent 3 years in China, and his conviction was that these unconventional resources were going to be much less common in China than most of the estimates from people like the EIA. I think what that does point out is the very large uncertainty inherent in this, and capturing and understanding uncertainty is going to be extremely important and challenging as we move ahead. If you do the systematic thinking about uncertainties, you do commonly find that there are just one or two factors that are absolutely critical, and maybe you can learn something more about them and substantially reduce those uncertainties. But I'm fond of a quote, which is that prediction is hard, especially about the future. And I was confused about which physicist it was that said that, whether it was the theoretical physicist Niels Bohr or the experimental physicist Yogi Berra. It turns out it's Niels Bohr. But it's really challenging. On the other hand, one should never say no one can predict. Having worked on predictions that looked out 10,000 years for Yucca Mountain for nuclear waste disposal, I can say you can predict. You just may not be able to predict all that precisely. I'm fond of a clip that I remember when Paul Volcker was asked by a bunch of reporters what's going to happen to interest rates, and he replied, interest rates will fluctuate. Big challenges ahead, and I'd have to say we're so early in this in any other part of the world other than the US and Canada that it's very hard to figure out where it's going to go. But I think water will not be the constraint on the hydraulic fracturing. Political will, social license to operate, and recycling, reuse of less high quality water, which is already happening in this country, will have to be a part of the development of any of these energy resources that may help us gather water resources and reprocess them.
Thank you. Any other question?
Got one down here.
Yes, Jim?
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Please, bro. Thank you. Mohammed Ramadi, King Fahd University, Petroleum Minerals of Saudi Arabia. Thank you all three. First of all, Ziad, our thoughts and prayers go with you in what is really a very tough environment, and we wish you all the success because you are putting in practice what really is insurmountable against all odds. I have several questions. Jeremy, I hope you can predict. And you showed a slide there on the break-even at 70, but then I noticed in some of the bigger plays, like Eagle Ford and so on, it went down all the way to 40, which of course we're going to be discussing tomorrow. Do you really know what is the break-even? Does anybody even know unless they look at the shale, the different players, the geology, and the economics? And this is really the big question mark, so I would like to hear from you. Zahra, you discussed food security. Yesterday I raised the issue of morality. In the Middle East, not only are they food scarce, but they are wasteful. The Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia have got the highest number of people in the world, both obesity and also diabetes. It comes from the lifestyle. We are wasting food. So part of food security is also to teach people how to eat properly and reduce it. The second one concerns the rather attitude that you can buy everything. I know they just bought $300 million of a painting, but going out to countries which are politically stressed, financially stressed, and trying to buy large tracts of their land and to make sure that you have food security is not an option. Because what happens when these societies have regime changes, the first thing that they do is cancel these agreements, which were corruptly done. And as an example, Egypt did that with one of the most prominent Saudi princes that we have, in terms of going in and saying, I will buy a tract of land to have food security for Saudi Arabia, but it's not also food security for Egypt. So I think there's an issue of ethics here, whereby we have to look, if we are going to invest overseas, it must be a two-way street, whereby you're leasing land, putting in that money to good use to invest in proper agricultural practices, which will be able to produce more food, both for the host country and also for the Middle East. I would like to hear your experiences on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Jim, and then we'll have the answers. Each panelist answer the two questions at the same time.
Yes, thank you very much. I actually have two questions about shale oil. One is, what are the capacities for using seawater for the extraction by fracturing? You referred to that, but I'm not familiar with that. I'd like to know more about the option of using seawater. And then secondly, about the balance between oil and gas extraction. What is the prospects for the balance between oil versus gas and extraction from shale? And how does that, if you know, I don't know if anyone knows, how does that balance affect the markets of these two products? Because we've seen the plunge in the price of crude, but I wonder if can you offset, do these two markets, are they really interrelated, and can the shale revolution affect the balance between the cost of oil and the cost of gas? Thank you.
Zahra, would you like to start?
Sure.
Okay.
Hi.
Oh, you have a question?
Yes.
I'll give you the, yeah, okay, if you want to start with the question, and then we'll gather. That would be last.
Okay. My question is for Dr. Mimi. You mentioned only 11% water for Palestinian people. So is this enough for basic human needs? And if it is not, is there any human rights organizations involved to solve this conflict? Because this is water. I mean, yes. That's what my question.
Could you please introduce yourself?
My name is Ayşe Ongun. I'm a special education expert in DC Public Schools.
Okay, thank you.
Is this on? Thank you so much for during my presentation, I cut out a chunk because I knew I was talking too much. But in the section where I was looking at how energy and food are spoken of, thought of, addressed, have become policy areas. And the other thing that I wanted to mention in that domain was it's also quite interesting how energy and food systems, we hear similar language in terms of how we need to change and modify human behavior, right? And those include things like the need to learn responsible consumption and the need to reduce wastage and to change wasteful practices and those sorts of things. And again, I found that an interesting connection point between energy and food when I was going through my work on it. The waste practices, you're absolutely right. These are ethical and moral issues, but it's certainly also about education and awareness raising. I would say I have become extremely suspicious about any data that's presented on the GCC for one very base fact. I mean, the figures you've related on obesity in the GCC are only applicable to nationals. In Qatar, the population is 2.3 million. The local population, I think, is under 250,000. And Qatar is consistently presented as being suffering from high degrees of obesity and obesity-related chronic diseases, whereas 800,000 people in Qatar are single men under the age of 35 who I really don't think are obese. So again, those figures, I don't understand how they're produced because they're related, they always say as per the whole population, and it's not. It's based on, so not at all to deviate from what you're saying, which is that there are issues around nutrition and consumption patterns. The GCC states rapid modernization, complete transformation in dietary practices in under 30 years. It's a phenomena that is quite unique to the region. And clearly the countries, all of the countries involved are engaging in some sort of campaigns to really have a healthcare sector that can cope with some of these problems. In this volume on food security that I edited we co-edited with a colleague, which came out of the Center of International and Regional Studies, we have a chapter specifically that looks at poor nutritional outcomes for young children in Qatar. The waste issue, again, I agree, it's a huge problem, but these are not unique to the Gulf. Then I don't think they should be exceptionalized. We have a lot on all of us have too much on our plates in many parts of the world, but I understand it, of course, has to be addressed. The overseas land purchase, I mean, absolutely, those were the concerns and the debates that although the GCC states were considering engaging in overseas agriculture, the actual purchase of land in some of these countries already prone to internal, domestic food security, having challenges around resources like water, and of course land purchases technically also mean you're buying the hidden water over there. But I actually think there has been very little in-depth research that tells us much about this. Most of what I've read on the GCC overseas land purchase has been speculative. It's been based in the press. We tried to fund a team of researchers to actually go to Ethiopia and Cambodia to assess GCC states' land investments, agricultural land purchases there, and they were unable to come back with any data verifying this. The only thing they came back with, yes, was technically so-and-so said that piece of land belonged to Saudi and that belonged to Kuwait. But I think there has been a real fear factor and withdrawal from this because there was such a negative it was such a negative attack, frankly, and scrutiny they came under. And while I absolutely agree with you, any interventions like this need to make sure that there's a win-win and there's a benefit to the local communities and the countries where these activities are taking place. The unfortunate thing is the GCC states actually would have the resources to perhaps help some of these lethargic agricultural sectors that exist in sub-Saharan Africa and pockets of Asia. But because of the way this whole thing was scrutinized, that's not going to happen. And that's unfortunate because somebody needs to make those investments.
Thank you for your question. Actually, you said that 11% is our share, and it is actually under the accepted water, the health organization. since WHO said that we should, at minimum, every person 150 liters per capita per day. And in some villages in the West Bank and Gaza, sometimes it reaches 40 liters per capita per day, which is too much less than the accepted. Regarding the questions, we have different organizations, international organizations in the West Bank, like UNICEF, WHO, and these organizations know that it's under the required accepted standards, but unfortunately, Israel is usually above the law. It's a country which is above the law. No one even can discuss these issues with Israel. It is above the law, even with the Security Councils, 242, 338. These decisions are above the law. How is about water? So we think it's a spoiled country, it is above the law, and we cannot force this country to do anything for Palestinians. Sorry for that. This is what happened there.
Jerry?
I hope I can remember all the questions. First, with respect to, well, I guess first I'd say it's a pleasure to be forced to learn a lot to do a credible presentation at a conference like this. I get to reach out and think much more broadly than I often do day to day. But one of the two things you learn to say as a consultant are, let's see, it depends and send money. The studies that would be needed to answer some of these questions would be really exciting to do, and there aren't necessarily available funds for them. Water, the water that is flowback water or that it is produced water from most geologic formations that contain hydrocarbons is what we might call vintage seawater. And increasingly, companies are trying to figure out how much of that flowback water they can use. It tends to be relatively salty, in fact, more salty than some seawater. So there are treatment processes you can use. It also tends to contain some radioactive isotopes that happen to occur naturally in rock and in fact in seawater. So there are issues about what you have to do with that water in order either to dispose of it or to reuse it. But a lot of work is being done on how to use much lower quality water for hydraulic fracturing. So that's an extremely important application. Using actual modern seawater is a challenge unless you happen to be relatively close. You would have to either establish a very large number, run a large number of trucks, or build a pipeline. The issues are not necessarily so much technical or in terms of getting the pipeline there. They're political. And do you want to transport seawater across several thousand miles or 1,000 miles of the American West or something like that to get it to a place? Is that feasible? Is that something we want to do? So the water use issue is a challenging one, but I think it's increasingly recycling the local water that will solve that problem, and to some extent that water that they're talking about is old seawater. The drop in oil prices that came in part because of a glut of oil production from unconventional fields in this country was preceded by an even more precipitous drop in gas prices produced by the production of unconventional gas from gas resources in this country. So oil prices are like interest. They fluctuate. And you can develop really complicated models to try and understand how they will develop. And Schlumberger has done that effort to try and show how it expects the light tight oil to develop. We do have a large amount of gas being produced in this country, and there are people looking to try and export it simply because there is, unlike oil, which does transit worldwide and therefore keep the price relatively homogenized except accounting for government subsidies, gas does not transport except in a limited way internationally, and so there are very large price differences. The reason there was excitement about drilling for gas in Poland was simply because that might help ease the throttle on Russian gas, which is a major source of supply. It's my feeling that Western European countries have pulled away from allowing hydraulic fracturing because they'd rather see it happen in Eastern Europe as an experimental ground and in places where people aren't quite as wealthy as they are in Western Europe. The same is happening in some parts of Pennsylvania. The desire to have it not in my backyard. And that's a major difficulty in balancing out some of these supplies. But the major reason for rapid development of these unconventional resources in the US is that people who own land sometimes also own mineral rights, and they're kind of happy to have that well on their land, even if perhaps it's a little noisy for a while or there are a lot of trucks. So you get a lot of, there are actually a complex set of local issues. If you only watch Gasland, you hear one side of it, but if you go out and see Frac Nation, you'll hear the other side of it. There's a large political component to the development of these resources, and there will continue to be. It's to be hoped for that at least scientific input will carry some part of the discussion, so that we don't do patently absurd things. But I'm afraid in the political world there is no guarantee of that.
May I follow on that, Jerry?
Yeah.
I found it interesting that there seems to be no consensus regarding the amount of water that is used for the extraction of shale oil. I mean, we hear usually that large amounts of water is needed, and then yesterday you raised an interesting question to Peter Glick, saying there's only 1% of the water resources which are being used. And considering that the three presentations have shown the interlinkages, I mean, we're talking about extraction of unconventional sources, which are impacting not only in terms of supplies of water, but there's also the gas emissions and the impact on climate change, which in turn has an impact on food security issues and on water scarcity, as we've seen in the case of Palestine, in addition to the political context. Is that issue of impact on climate change taken into account in the industry, besides the focus on the profits that could come from these wonderful new resources, which in fact bring energy independence to the US? There's also the issue, I mean, if now with the pipeline which was approved yesterday, the whole discussion is about dirty oil being produced. Is that something that you would account for when you assess the impact of these resources?
I would hope it gets accounted for. It's an important and vital issue. It's fairly clear that some elements of the oil and gas industry have been a little bit retrograde in on the issue of climate change. But the study that I'm working on now, that I took that slide from a paper that some of my co-PIs or co-authors on, recognizes that there is a disconnect between some estimates of how much methane is being emitted, two different approaches, and we're in the midst of developing a project. That project is co-funded by 4 different large oil companies. One international, Statoil, XTO representing ExxonMobil, Southwestern Energy, an independent oil and gas company, and Chevron. So there's very great interest in the belief that that the issue has to be addressed, that we have to find out, and particularly because there is this, as I mentioned, this understanding that you have what in probability terms we call a fat tail, a small number of facilities accounting for a very large number of the emissions. The better we can get out there and identify where those are, what types they are, and which ones they are, the easier it is to fix it and to not leak that methane into the system. So it's driven both by profit and by the acknowledgement that the social license to operate is challenging. All of these companies recognize it. The flip side of that is that it involves the exchange of highly confidential information, and universities can be a bit risky in that field. We're encountering that. Having worked at Los Alamos and been cleared for national security information, I'm highly sensitive to it, but there are limits to how perfectly you can control the exchange of that information. So there are some major issues. I think the companies are certainly cognizant of it. They don't want to waste the gas. And they also have a tendency to put forward their viewpoint, which might resist some other efforts. But as I say, if you've seen the Gasland movie and you haven't seen Frac Nation, you've seen only a one-sided view, and everyone ought to see both of those. They're both somewhat political. If you really want to understand the issues in the energy challenges ahead, you might want to look into a movie called Switch, which was put together by the director of the Bureau of Economic Geology in Texas, Scott Tinker, who is a really brilliant performer in terms of presenting the technical issues of the grand energy switch we're going through right now in relatively good non-technical terms. It's a good way to understand what it takes to make the transition. As far as the volumes of water are concerned, this is an industrial process, and virtually all industrial processes use large amounts of water. Intel built a plant in Albuquerque, and their water demands were absolutely humongous in comparison, but nevertheless, still they're small compared to agricultural demands. When you look at any industrial process that uses a large amount of water, the actual amounts are quite small, so we can't really solve those major water issues without looking very carefully at what it takes to balance our water needs. I'm afraid that tends to lead to, first of all, lots more detailed analysis. This is great for university professors, but it also might require moving towards more complicated systems of governance, and that's something that's probably resisted fairly strongly in corners of the District of Columbia and elsewhere in the country.
Thank you. There's time for a few last questions. If anyone wants to raise an issue, yes, please go.
Good morning, Hassan Amiri, Colorado School of Mines. Thank you all for the presentations. I learned a lot from them. I'd like to ask Zahra if she can speak to the politicization of food, and how that is driving, or how that affects the farming abroad or land grabbing by Gulf states and others to try and secure a reliable source of food. What I mean by the politicization of food, I'm talking about the historical process. I mean, the food has been used as a political tool for a long time, as I'm sure you know. Thank you.
Is there any other question? So we'll end with this question, and if you have last comments, and we'll close the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. We have an expert on the historic politicization sitting in the audience. Eckhart has worked on this and wrote a chapter for our book on it. The fact is that actually, while the Gulf states, the GCC states in particular, have received a lot of negative attention, frankly, for this whole need or whatever that they have to produce food or be self-sufficient and control the supply of food, even if it's externally sourced. But as we know, I mean, there actually is a historical memory of precedent in the Middle East, where food has been used as a weapon, and where you've had forced famines as a result of blockades and wars and things like that. So it's not just paranoia that's fueling these issues, and the need, although sane, rational economics will tell you that these countries have no comparative advantage in producing food locally. Their comparative advantage is in exporting their energy sources and using normal balance of trades to purchase their food on the open market, that you can't always say with 100% certainty that that's always going to be possible, right? And it's interesting because if we look at Iran, for example, they have pursued a policy since the ayah, the Islamic Republic, came into place, part of a nationalistic agenda setting of being domestically self-sufficient in food. And again, these policies not considered incredibly economically sound, because they could be sourcing a lot of their food internationally at cheaper prices compared to what they're growing it for. It costs them to grow it. But in the long run, the fact that Iran has succeeded in being pretty much self-sufficient in key food sectors has helped them in the current climate of isolation. So countries that choose that path, that decide to make food a political issue and build an agenda around it, have enough examples in the neighborhood to feel that that they should be doing this, that there's a valuable reason to do so.
We're almost, and the end of the panel. Erkar, do you have a last question? Quick one, please, and then maybe we can raise it also in the the next panels as well.
Okay, it's also regarding food, that's why. Just one comment maybe regarding fertilizers. Apart from nitrogen fertilizers, there's phosphate, right? And phosphate is equally important as a macronutrient, and it's an element, so you cannot replace it. Nitrogen, you could you could use other energy sources to produce it, as long you have air, essentially. And here the Middle East has even a stronger standing in global markets, as just recently in 2010 and then in the USGS in 2011, they've updated the reserve base massively of Morocco, so they have about 3/4 of global phosphate reserves Add to that Jordan, add to that Syria, Iraq has about 9% of global phosphate reserves in Anbar province, and the upcoming large-scale project in Al-Jalamid in Saudi Arabia. The dominance in global phosphate reserves is even more pronounced than in the case of oil.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll continue to explore these issues in the next panel. So thank you very much to our panelists. We have 15 minutes break, and the next panel will start at 11. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.